Hello there and welcome to another Bow Beats synth review. Today we're taking a look at the newly announced Minibrute 2 from Arturia, and here it is. Let's try again. Here it is. Yeah, here it is. Here's the Minibrute. It's a little bit too big to fit on camera, but it's really cool. The Minibrute 2 is not just the sequel to the much beloved Minibrute, it's actually sort of their mid-tier synth, their new mid-tier synth between something like the Matrix Brute and the older Minibrutes. Because it's not just like a new version of the Minibrute, it's actually something much more. And I want to start off with just some quick things about this synth, and then we'll go into sort of the specific, do an overview of all the functions. We'll demo some sounds, we'll create some sounds on the fly, we'll check out the sequencer and whatnot. So bear with me, it's going to be a little bit of a longer review, but this will be pretty much everything you will need to know about this synth. So this is a monophonic, one voice, two oscillator synth with 3 LFOs if you use oscillator number 2 as an LFO. It has 2 envelopes. You have a patch bay over here, and the patch bay has 48 patch points, and it brings a ton of utility. It also makes it so you can interface it, connect it with a Eurorack or Mother 32, but it's also something that opens up a lot of creative possibilities. And not to forget, there's a sequencer on it as well. It's sort of the same deal as on a key step, so it's basically, if you have a key step, you'll feel right at home. It's basically a key step sequencer slapped on top of this already great synth, so that's pretty cool as well. I really enjoyed using this for the time I've had it. I'm probably going to use it a ton more, but now let's get into the specifics about this synth. So the Minibrute 2 comes with 2 oscillators, the VCO number 1 and VCO number 2. VCO number 1 is the full oscillator. It's very similar to something like on the Matrix Brute, but it doesn't have its own dedicated sub-oscillator, so you might want to use VCO 2 for that. Now VCO 1 has fine tune, it has glide, it also has frequency modulation, where it uses VCO 2 to create frequency modulation, but this can of course be changed using the patch bay. You also have ultrasaw amount, you have pulse width modulation and pulse width, you have metalizer and metal mod. Some of these knobs here are interconnected. Fine tune and frequency modulation there's a little line here that indicates that those two are connected by default, but you can disable it using the patch bay. For example, the pulse width is of course connected to pulse width modulation, and there's blue text under each knob, which also lets you know what source modulates that respective function or knob. So for example, the frequency modulation modulated by VCO2, and of course it depends on the settings over on VCO2 of course, and ultrasaw amount is modulated by LFO2, and pulse width modulation is modulated by LFO number 1. And the available waveforms are sawtooth, square and triangle, and you can mix between them and use these knobs over here to create some really interesting sounds. So let's start off by listening to the individual waveforms here and see how we can change up the sounds using the parameters of the VCO1. So here I have a little sequence here, and we'll start off with the sawtooth. And for the sawtooth, we have the ultra saw amount, which is modulated by default by LFO2. So let's add some ultra saw. So as you can hear, it beefs up the sound quite a bit, and you can of course use LFO2 to increase the modulation rate. And LFO2 is at the moment set to a triangle waveform, but we could go to sine as well. Or to a sawtooth itself, or a square wave. Or perhaps go random. Or the second random, that has more of a curved randomness to it. Not those sharp edges. So that was a sawtooth. Let's bring in the square and use some pulse width as well as some pulse width modulation. And the pulse width modulation is modulated by the LFO1 default, but you can of course use the patch bay to change that if you want to. So we're adding pulse width. And now we can modulate the pulse width using pulse width modulation using the LFO number 1. So that was the square waveform. Now let's see here. Let's go into the triangle waveform here. The metalizer really changes up the sound of the triangle waveform, and you'll hear just how it's a very potent tool. We have the noise. It's a random noise. We can just listen to it. And in this mixer section we also have the external input that lets a signal from the patch bay over, let's see here, over here, the external input over on the patch bay, lets it go through the entire circuitry of the synth. And you also have oscillator 2, and we can listen to it. Oscillator 2 has a couple of different settings here. You can have a sine wave, you can have a sawtooth, you can have a square wave. You also have settings for the tuning. So there's fine, all, and LFO. So let's bring it in here on a sine wave. let's go to a sawtooth. And we also have the square wave. And while we're talking about the sound capabilities of the synth, we have to mention the elephant in the room, the patch bay. It's a 48 patch point patch bay that you can use to create some really interesting results and sounds, but you can also connect it to a Eurorack synth or Mother 32 or the Matrix Brute, or say another, a Minibrute, for example, or Microbrute. So there's a ton of options here, and I don't want to go too in depth because the video will be super long, but there's a couple of hidden features. So for example, there's the sync input that lets you do the hard sync sounds. And there's linear FM. So we had exponential FM earlier, and this is linear FM. And basically those are available on the patch bay, but not as knobs, so you have to set it up. So what I have set up here is a sync sound, a typical sync sound. This is described in the manual. This is my kind of take on it. I've done some tweaks to it. And let me just play you a little bit of what it can sound like. And we can bring in the triangle here and lower the sawtooth a bit. And just to mention a little bit about the patch bay here, there's a ton of options. You have the VCOs, you have the filters, the amp, you have an inverter, which is really handy. It's a kind of a utility thing. You have attenuators. The attenuators are interesting because you can use them to tame, say, an LFO, for example. So you get a dedicated knob here over on attenuator 1 and attenuator 2 knobs in order to kind of tame LFO. You can input, say, an LFO from a Mother 32 instead and tame that. So I think that's a lot of utility right here. But of course, this is super in-depth. You can do a ton of things, and we'll leave it at that for now. But if you want me to do a follow-up video showing you more about the patch bay, leave a little comment down below. Another really cool thing that you can use to sort of beef up the sound is using the frequency modulation here that uses VCO number 2 to affect the pitch or the fine-tuning of the oscillator number 1. And this is exponential FM, and you can also have linear FM using the patch bay, but it's not available as a knob. So let me just show you here by playing a little sequence, and we'll bring in the triangle, and let's listen to how this will sort of beef the sound up a little bit if you just use it sparingly. So it's just a slight difference in kind of perceived tuning, but it gives it a sort of a richer tone, which is really cool, and it's very noticeable when you use, for example, this unaffected triangle. But if we go overboard, you'll hear that you can easily destroy the sound with it as well. Bring in some metalizer here, you can get some funny results. Oh, and a little note about kind of the sound quality of Arturia synths. I find that sometimes when you just listen to kind of the raw sound of it, It's sort of like listening to, say, a Minilogue. It's not something that jumps out at you, like sounding super creamy, super fat. I think, for example, something like a Sub 37 kind of has that kind of wow factor to a lot of people. But at the same time, I do find that the Arturia synths have a ton of versatility when it comes to shaping the sound. And it's about finding the sweet spot, finding the right amount of brute factor and everything to kind of fatten up the sound. So I do think you have to put in a little bit of work, but at the same time, you have a really nice palette to create some interesting sounds, and especially using the patch points on the patch bay in this particular case. So while you might not get overwhelmed by the sound quality, I do think it has a ton of potential, and I hope some of my demos in this video has shown you that. There are two dedicated LFOs, LFO 1 and 2, but you can also use oscillator number 2 as an LFO, of course. These oscillators share the same functions. Firstly, you have a couple of different waveforms. So you have sine wave, you have triangle, you have sawtooth, square wave, random with the sort of sharp edges, and you have random with the more curved edges. So it's a much smoother randomness. Then you have the rate knob, and that of course affects the speed. And the speed is also affected by if you set it to sync to sequencer, or if you want it to run freely. There's also a LFO setting here on the keyboard, so with a shift command you can set how the LFO will re-trigger both the LFO 1 and 2 individually. And basically if you enable it, it'll re-trigger with every note that is being played. Otherwise it will just, continue its full cycle regardless of new notes being played. And both LFOs are available as outputs on the patch bay as well, so you can patch them to something else rather than their default configurations. Next up we have the filter section. You have your cutoff, resonance, mode select. Modes are low pass, band pass, high pass, and notch. You also have frequency modulation, which is not to be confused with the frequency modulation over on the VCO number 1. This basically modulates the cutoff by default, and it uses the ADSR down here to do it. So basically how you set the ADSR envelope and the amount here, positive or negative amount, will impact and modulate the cutoff. And the same goes for the resonance modulation, which is a little bit more unusual on a synthesizer. I haven't seen that on that many synths, that you have the resonance modulation as a kind of a default parameter or knob. So you have the resonance modulation here, which is set to the LFO number 1. So LFO number 1 will impact the resonance. And you also have the attenuator 1 to cutoff here, which basically impacts the cutoff, and you use the mod wheel to set the amount. So that's how you kind of use it. So next up we come here to the ADSR. The ADSR is an attack, decay, sustain, and release envelope that is default set to affect FM, basically affecting the cutoff. So here it is without any sort of modulation. And let's add some modulation. A nifty thing is that you have this little lamp here that shows you basically in strength how the ADSR comes into play. So if I put down the attack, you'll see it will just blink quickly. And if I have a long attack, you'll see that the lamp sort of increases in strength. I found it more useful really than what I thought it would be, because it gives you kind of this visual representation of how the ADSR affects basically the cutoff over here. So I thought that was really cool. And while we're speaking about envelopes, here is the main amp envelope, the AD. So it's basically an attack and decay envelope. So let's listen to it. With gate and trig settings here, basically that will impact the release of the sound. That's on the gate setting, and now we're on the trig setting. And gate again. So it's mainly for the length of the sound. And we also have a really nifty function here that you can set the 80 here, the amp envelope, to ones or to loop. And loop is really cool. So this is just with the ones here. But if we set it to loop, it starts to loop, obviously. But this has some really fun options to it. So if we set it to trig here, it'll just continue looping. And that lets you go into some really cool, almost granular territory. And you can reverse. Which I think is really cool. I haven't seen that on many synths. I just found it a really interesting little option here to change up the sound, to create some really crazy sounds. And you can even do some really cool rhythmic stuff, like this, for example. Next up we have the amp section over here, where you have the master volume. The master volume affects both the headphones output and the main output. And you also have the brute factor. It's a little bit hard for me to explain what it does, but it does beef up the sound quite a bit, and you can really go into some crazy territory with it. You also have the global tuning, as well as attenuator 2 to amp. This basically lets you hear a note. That's the function it has if you don't route it differently in the patch section. And it can be really cool to use to create some drone sounds, or if you have the AD envelope here in loop mode, you can bring in sort of a tone over the loop, which is really cool and can really beef up the sound quite a bit. And let's listen to the brute factor here. So here's without. And as you can hear, you can really break the sound. Now, when we had a look at the AD envelope here, you might notice that it's sort of limited with attack and decay. And you might wonder, can you create kind of expressive sounds? Now, I'm not saying that I'm really good at that. It's not perhaps, my strong suit to create expressive sounds, and I'm not a keyboard player. But I did create something here to kind of show you the power of the patch bay in combination with the options you have here. So what we got here is that we have the ADSR that offers a lot of control over, it offers a lot of control over sound. And I've patched it from the output into the decay of the AD envelope to add more expression. I've also patched LFO number 1 into the attenuators here, and basically it goes to the cutoff, and hopefully it'll show you that you can create some expressive sounds using the patch bay. So next up, let's talk about the keyboard and arpeggiator / sequencer. First off, the keyboard is the same as on the Minibrute, so it's a pretty solid keyboard. It's not my favorite, but it does the job well. And it is of course velocity sensitive, and it has aftertouch. Over in this section we have the pitch wheel and the mod wheel. They're made out of, I think, aluminum, and they feel pretty sturdy actually. And we also have the octaves up and down keys, which also doubles with the shift key as settings for the sequencer. So if you hold shift and you press the transpose key, basically what it does is that when you play a key and you have a sequence running, you'll transpose the entire sequence. And if you hold shift and press keyboard play, it means that while you have a sequence running, if you play the keyboard, you'll sort of override the sequence. You'll be able to play together with your sequence. You also have the pitch bend range knob here, which ranges from one semitone up to an octave here, so you can set it to whatever you like. And here we have two switches. Basically, the first switch here selects a mod source, the source that will affect a destination with the second little switch here. So either you have it set to wheel or you have it set to aftertouch. So either the wheel, the mod wheel, or the aftertouch will affect the LFO1 amount, which is default set to pitch, or to the mod CV output on the patch bay. So this is just a setting that you can choose. And for example, you could have the set to wheel, and you can set it to mod CV, and then go to the patch bay and set it to whatever you want the wheel to affect. So it's a very quick and handy way of making a change to the mod wheel, for example, or the aftertouch. And over here is the switch for the sequencer or ARP mode. They are exclusive, so you either have the sequencer or the ARP playing at one time. So I'm pretty sure that you've noticed by now that the sequencer and arpeggiator here is very similar to the key step from Arturia. It's basically the same thing. It's a little bit more limited in the sense that you can't, for example, have a sequence running and then sending MIDI on a different track to say another synthesizer and playing it. That's something you can do on the key step. You can't do it on this unit here. But if you want to check out my video on the key step, I'll leave a little link in the description. So just like on the key step, use the sequencer / ARP mode here to either, in sequencer mode, you select what sequence that you want to have played. Basically, if you record a sequence onto, say, number 6, it'll save, and you can go to number 7, you can save it. And in ARP mode, basically, it just switches between if it's going up and down or random or ordered. So it's basically how the arpeggiator operates. And then you have time division over here. Yeah, that's what it is. It sets the speed of the sequence or arpeggiator running. And you of course have the rate here, which sets the BPM. So that's pretty much how it works. And just to give you a little idea here, if we're in ARP mode, we press play, we hold shift, we tap hold here to create a hold, yeah, so we can just hold down a key. And you can add up to 16 different notes. And now it's playing ordered, and we can just go random. And a nifty function is that if you hold shift and you switch from, now we're at 116 to 132, it doesn't change automatically. Basically we have to let go of shift in order to hear that shift to 132. And just like on the key step, there's a bunch of secondary functions here that are used with shift here. You can set gate length, swing values, so that's something you can do on the fly as well. But now let's get into the sequencer. So we switch to sequencer mode. We'll go to an empty sequence number 8 here. We're at 1/16. And basically what you do is you press record, and basically the notes you play will go into the sequence, and you can use this tap or rest button here, rather, the tap/rest, to create basically, well, rests or spaces between the notes. So let's see here. And now what you can do is if you press record while it's playing, we can add notes on top here. So as you can see, it's very easy to use the sequencer, but it does not have that kind of in-depth control that you might want. For example, like on the BeatStep Pro, for example, you have much more control over the sequence in a more graphical way. Here, it has a lot more to do with you understanding how to sort of create an interesting sequence. It's even a little bit of math involved, I think, when you sort of count the steps you want to use and so on. But you can also back up the sequence and create sequences on the software that you get with this synth, so that's also good to know. So this was my review of the Arturia Minibrute 2. I hope you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing if you like videos about synthesizers, creativity, music production, and that sort of thing. And if you want to support me further, you can always head over to patreon.com/bowbeats and make a little monthly donation to support the channel and the time I invest in this project. So guys, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a super pleasant day. Thank you.